What would you do if the person you loved most turned out to be your worst nightmare? In the scorching summer of 1902, in the quiet farming community of Fenmore, Tennessee, a discovery beneath the apple trees would expose a truth so dark that it would haunt the town for generations. This is the story of Margaret Holloway, the widow who buried her secrets in the orchard. Fenmore sat nestled in the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee, where tobacco fields stretched across the valleys and church bells marked the rhythm of life. The town counted barely 300 souls, most of them farmers who worked the rich soil their grandfathers had tilled before them. Everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noted with curious glances from porch swings and general store counters. It was the kind of place where a man's word was his bond, and a woman's reputation mattered more than gold. Margaret Holloway lived on the edge of town, in a 2-story white house that overlooked 5 acres of apple orchards. The property had belonged to her late husband, Thomas Holloway, a successful merchant who had died 7 years earlier in what folks said was a tragic accident. He had fallen from the barn loft, breaking his neck on the hard-packed earth below. Margaret had found him herself, her screams bringing neighbors running across the fields. At his funeral, she had worn black veils and wept so convincingly that even the most cynical church ladies had pressed her hands with genuine sympathy. The widow was 42 years old in the summer of 1902, though she looked younger. She had dark hair that she wore pinned up in the fashion of the day, and grey eyes that could shift from warmth to coldness in an instant. Her figure remained slim despite her years, and men noticed. After a respectable mourning period, she had begun accepting callers, and over the years, several men had courted her with varying degrees of success. Some had simply disappeared, their departures explained by Margaret as sudden business opportunities in Memphis or Nashville. Others, she said, had found her too independent, too unwilling to surrender the property that Thomas had left her. The townspeople accepted these explanations without much question. After all, Margaret was a woman of means, and a woman of means could afford to be particular. The summer of 1902 brought drought to Tennessee. The rain that usually fell in gentle afternoon showers simply stopped coming. The earth cracked like old leather, and farmers watched their crops wither under a merciless sun. Rivers shrank to muddy trickles, and wells that had never run dry began to fail. In Fenmore, people spoke of the drought in the same hushed tones they used for illness and death, recognizing it as a biblical punishment, though none could say what sin had brought such suffering upon them. On Margaret Holloway's property, the apple trees began to die. She had hired a man named Samuel Grant to help maintain the orchard, a widower himself who had been courting Margaret for nearly 6 months. Samuel was 50 years old, solidly built, with calloused hands and a reputation for honesty. He had suggested digging a new well closer to the orchard, where the water table might still hold enough moisture to save the trees. Margaret had agreed, and on July 15th Samuel arrived with his tools and his determination. He chose a spot beneath the oldest apple tree, where the ground seemed slightly softer than elsewhere. As he drove his shovel into the earth, he had no idea that he was about to uncover a horror that would shatter Fenmore's peaceful existence forever. Samuel Grant worked methodically, the way he approached everything in his life. He started digging at dawn, when the air still held a hint of coolness before the sun turned the world into an oven. Margaret brought him water and biscuits, her grey eyes watching him with an expression he could not quite read. She seemed nervous, he thought, but then again the drought had made everyone anxious. The possibility of losing an entire orchard was enough to make any property owner restless. By mid-morning, Samuel had dug down about 4 feet. The earth was hard and unforgiving, each shovelful requiring real effort. Sweat soaked through his shirt and ran down his face, stinging his eyes. He paused to wipe his forehead with his sleeve, and that was when his shovel struck something that was not rock or root. The sound was different, duller, and when he looked down into the hole, he saw what appeared to be fabric, rotted and stained with soil. His first thought was that he had found an old sack, perhaps something buried years ago and forgotten, but as he carefully cleared away more dirt, the fabric revealed itself to be clothing, and beneath the clothing were bones. Samuel stopped digging. His heart hammered in his chest as his mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. These were human remains, unmistakably so. The skull had rolled to one side, its empty eye sockets staring at nothing. Fragments of a shirt clung to the ribcage, and one skeletal hand still wore a gold ring. Samuel climbed out of the hole on legs that felt suddenly weak. He looked toward the house, where Margaret stood on the back porch, shading her eyes against the sun as she watched him. He raised his hand, gesturing for her to come, but something in her posture made him hesitate. She did not move. She simply stood there, perfectly still. And in that moment, Samuel understood with terrible clarity that she had known what he would find. He left the property without speaking to her. He walked the mile into town, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step, and went directly to Sheriff William Crane's office. The sheriff was a lean man of 60, with a grey mustache and eyes that missed very little. He listened to Samuel's account without interruption, his expression growing graver with each word. When Samuel finished, Sheriff Crane stood up, reached for his hat, and called for his deputy, a young man named Robert Hayes. The three men returned to the Holloway property in the sheriff's wagon. Margaret met them at the front gate, her face pale but composed. She did not ask why they had come. She did not protest when Sheriff Crane told her they needed to examine what Samuel had found. She simply led them to the orchard, her black skirts rustling softly in the oppressive heat. Sheriff Crane looked into the hole, then looked at Margaret. His voice when he spoke was carefully neutral, the voice of a man who had learned long ago not to reveal his thoughts until he had all the facts. He asked her if she knew who was buried there. She said she did not. He asked her if she had any idea how a body had come to be buried beneath her apple tree. She said she did not. Her answers were quiet and steady, without a tremor of fear or guilt. But Sheriff Crane had been a lawman for 30 years, and he knew when someone was lying. He told Margaret that he would need to investigate further, and that she should not leave town. She nodded, still composed, still calm. As the men began to carefully excavate the remains, she returned to her house and closed the door. News of the discovery spread through Fenmore like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, half the town knew that human remains had been found on the Holloway property. By the next morning, everyone knew. People gathered in small groups outside the general store and the post office, their voices low and urgent as they shared theories and memories. Someone remembered that Margaret's husband Thomas had been buried quickly, with a closed casket, the explanation being that his fall had damaged him too badly for viewing. Someone else recalled how Margaret had always seemed just a little too composed, too controlled, even in moments when emotion would have been natural. Sheriff Crane worked through the night. He brought in Dr. Henry Morrison, the only physician in Fenmore, to examine the remains. Dr. Morrison was a precise man who approached his work with scientific detachment, but even he seemed shaken by what they found. The body had been in the ground for several years, perhaps 5 or 6 based on the degree of decomposition. The clothing suggested a man, and the gold ring on the skeletal finger was engraved with initials that Dr. Morrison carefully noted. J.R. The sheriff consulted his records. 5 years ago, a man named James Reynolds had come to Fenmore. He had been a traveling salesman, well-dressed and charming, and he had taken a room at the boarding house while he conducted business in the area. He had been seen frequently in Margaret Holloway's company, and there had been talk that perhaps the widow had finally found someone to marry. Then one day, James Reynolds had simply vanished. His belongings remained at the boarding house for a week before the landlady packed them up and stored them in her attic. People assumed he had moved on to his next territory without bothering to say goodbye. Now, Sheriff Crane realized, they had been wrong. The sheriff obtained a warrant and returned to the Holloway property with 4 men and shovels. If there was one body buried in the orchard, there might be others. Margaret watched from her window as they began to dig, methodically working their way through the rows of apple trees. The men worked in shifts through the scorching heat, driven by a grim determination to uncover the truth. They found the second body that afternoon, 20 feet from the first. This one was less decomposed, perhaps 3 years in the ground. The remains wore a suit, and in the jacket pocket they found a wallet containing identification papers for a man named Henry Atkins. Sheriff Crane remembered him too. Henry had been a widower from Nashville who had courted Margaret for several months before supposedly returning to Nashville to care for an ailing sister. No one had questioned his departure, No one had thought to ask Margaret for more details. The third body came up just before sunset. This one was fresher, perhaps only 2 years buried. The skull showed clear evidence of trauma, a crack that ran from the temple to the back of the head. Dr. Morrison examined it carefully and declared that such an injury would have been instantly fatal. The dead man wore a silver pocket watch that had stopped at 10:45. Inside the watch case was an inscription, "To Samuel, with love from Mother." But this was not Samuel Grant. This was another Samuel, another man who had walked into Margaret Holloway's life and never walked out again. As darkness fell and the men finally stopped digging, 3 bodies lay covered with canvas beside the holes from which they had been taken. Sheriff Crane looked toward the house, where lamplight glowed in the windows. He had seen many things in his years as a lawman, but nothing had prepared him for this. He sent Deputy Hayes to bring Margaret Holloway to the jailhouse. When Hayes knocked on her door, she opened it immediately, already wearing her hat and carrying a small bag, as if she had been expecting him. The arrest of Margaret Holloway sent shockwaves far beyond Fenmore. The story reached Nashville within 2 days and Memphis shortly after. Newspaper reporters descended on Fenmore like crows to a cornfield, their notebooks and cameras transforming the quiet town into something resembling a circus. They photographed the Holloway house from every angle, interviewed anyone willing to talk, and filed sensational stories that grew more lurid with each retelling. The headlines screamed, "The Widow Who Buried Her Lovers, Tennessee's Black Widow, The Orchard of Death." Margaret's face appeared in newspapers across Tennessee and beyond, her calm expression in the jail photograph somehow making her seem even more sinister. Sheriff Crane continued his investigation. He examined Margaret's financial records and discovered a pattern that was both simple and chilling. Each of the men who had courted her had been relatively wealthy. Each had been unmarried or widowed without close family to ask uncomfortable questions, and each, according to the careful records that Margaret had kept, had signed over significant assets to her before disappearing. James Reynolds had transferred the deed to a property in Memphis. Henry Atkins had added her name to his bank account in Nashville. The second Samuel had given her $3,000 in cash, supposedly to invest in expanding the orchard. The sheriff interviewed neighbors and townspeople, piecing together a timeline of deception that spanned 7 years. Margaret had been methodical, never taking a new lover too soon after the last one vanished, always maintaining the appearance of a respectable widow who was simply unlucky in love. She had played her role perfectly, attending church every Sunday, contributing to charitable causes, hosting respectable gatherings at her home. No one had suspected because no one had wanted to suspect. In a small town like Fenmore, such evil seemed impossible. Dr. Morrison continued examining the remains. The first body, James Reynolds, showed signs of poisoning. The bones had a peculiar discoloration that Morrison recognized from medical texts about arsenic exposure. The second body, Henry Atkins, showed similar signs. Only the third body, the second Samuel, showed clear evidence of blunt force trauma. Morrison theorized that Margaret had been using poison as her primary method, but something had gone wrong with the third victim. Perhaps he had grown suspicious, or perhaps the poison had worked too slowly and she had been forced to finish the job more directly. In her jail cell, Margaret Holloway maintained her innocence. She claimed she knew nothing about the bodies, suggesting that perhaps previous owners of the property had buried them, or that the men had been killed by unknown assailants and their bodies dumped on her land. Her story was contradicted by the evidence, but she stuck to it with unshakable determination. She ate her meals without apparent distress, slept soundly, and showed no signs of remorse or fear. The deputies who guarded her found her composure unnerving. One said it was like watching a snake sunning itself on a rock, dangerous and cold-blooded. The prosecutor, an ambitious young lawyer named Thomas Mitchell, began preparing his case. He had witnesses who could testify about Margaret's relationships with the victims. He had financial records showing the transfer of assets. He had Dr. Morrison's expert testimony about the causes of death. Most damaging of all, he had the bodies themselves, found buried on her property beneath trees she tended daily. It seemed an open and shut case, but Mitchell was taking no chances. This would be the biggest trial in Tennessee in decades, and he intended to win it. As summer turned to autumn and the drought finally broke with thunderstorms that washed away the dust, Fenmore tried to return to normal life. But everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The trial of Margaret Holloway began on October 15, 1902, in the courthouse at the county seat, a red brick building that suddenly became the center of attention for people across the entire state. The courtroom could hold perhaps 200 people, but 5 times that many showed up on the first day, crowding the streets outside and craning their necks for any glimpse through the windows. Judge Harold Whitmore, a stern man with white hair and a reputation for fairness, ordered extra deputies to maintain order and announced that he would tolerate no disturbances from spectators. Margaret entered the courtroom wearing a simple black dress, her hair neatly arranged, her expression calm and composed. She looked more like a schoolteacher than a murderer, and several women in the gallery whispered that surely there had been some mistake, that such a refined woman could not possibly have done the things she was accused of. But others remembered the 3 bodies pulled from her orchard and felt their blood run cold at her composure. What kind of woman could maintain such perfect control in the face of such accusations? Prosecutor Thomas Mitchell opened with a methodical presentation of the evidence. He called Sheriff Crane to the stand, who described the discovery of the bodies and the subsequent investigation. The sheriff's testimony was detailed and damning, each fact building upon the last to create a picture of calculated murder. He described how each victim had transferred assets to Margaret before vanishing, how the timeline of the burials matched the timeline of the disappearances, how Margaret's own records showed the financial transactions that had enriched her with each death. Dr. Henry Morrison followed, explaining the medical evidence. He spoke in technical terms that made some of the jurors lean forward in concentration, describing the bone discoloration consistent with arsenic poisoning, the skull fracture that would have caused instant death, the estimated time each body had been in the ground. He brought charts and diagrams, pointing to specific details that supported his conclusions. When Mitchell asked him if he had any doubt about the causes of death, Morrison replied firmly that he had none whatsoever. These men had been murdered, and the evidence suggested their killer had buried them immediately after their deaths. The defense attorney, a man named Charles Beaumont, who had come from Memphis specifically for this case, tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. He suggested that the bodies could have been placed on Margaret's property by someone else, perhaps the real killer trying to frame her. He pointed out that no one had actually witnessed Margaret committing murder, that all the evidence was circumstantial, that transfer of assets from a man courting a woman was not unusual or illegal, but his arguments seemed to fall flat against the weight of the physical evidence and the damning timeline. Witnesses came forward, one after another, painting a picture of Margaret's relationships with the dead men. The boarding house landlady testified about James Reynolds, describing how he had been besotted with the widow, how he had spoken of marrying her and settling down in Fenmore. A banker from Nashville testified about Henry Atkins, confirming that he had added Margaret's name to his account just weeks before his disappearance. A neighbor testified about the second Samuel, saying she had seen him working in Margaret's orchard on multiple occasions, had heard him speaking of his intention to help her expand her business, had noticed that his wagon had been left behind when he supposedly departed for parts unknown. Through it all, Margaret sat quietly at the defense table, occasionally whispering to her attorney, but showing no visible emotion. She did not weep or protest. She did not cry out her innocence or plead for understanding. She simply sat, her grey eyes watching the proceedings with an expression that witnesses later described as almost curious, as if she were attending a play rather than fighting for her life. This eerie calm disturbed the jurors more than tears or hysteria might have done. It suggested a coldness at her core that made the accusations against her seem entirely believable. As the prosecution built its case, piece by damning piece, even those who had initially doubted her guilt began to reconsider. On the 4th day of the trial, Prosecutor Mitchell called a witness who would prove to be his most compelling. Her name was Elizabeth Carter, and she had worked as Margaret Holloway's housekeeper for 2 years, leaving her employment just 6 months before the bodies were discovered. Elizabeth was a thin woman in her 50s, with nervous hands that she kept clasping and unclasping as she took the stand. She spoke quietly, and Judge Whitmore had to ask her twice to raise her voice so the jury could hear her testimony. Elizabeth testified that she had seen Margaret mixing powders into drinks on several occasions. When asked what kind of powders, Elizabeth said she did not know, but that Margaret had kept them in a locked drawer in her bedroom and had always been very careful to ensure that no one else touched them. On one occasion, Elizabeth had walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and found Margaret stirring something white into a glass of whiskey. When Margaret noticed her, she had gone very still, and then she had smiled and explained that she was adding a headache remedy to the drink for her gentleman caller, who had been suffering from a migraine. Elizabeth had thought nothing of it at the time, but now, with the knowledge of what had been found in the orchard, the memory took on a sinister significance. The housekeeper also testified about changes she had noticed in the house after certain visitors stopped coming around. After James Reynolds disappeared, Margaret had suddenly acquired new furniture and a fine set of china. After Henry Atkins vanished, Margaret had hired workers to repair the barn and add a new room to the house. After the second Samuel left, Margaret had purchased a carriage and a horse of exceptional quality. At the time, Elizabeth had assumed that Margaret was simply spending her late husband's money wisely, but now she understood that the widow had been spending money that had belonged to her victims. Most damning of all, Elizabeth described an incident that had occurred late one night about 3 years earlier. She had been unable to sleep and had gone downstairs for a glass of water. Through the kitchen window, she had seen lamplight in the orchard and the silhouette of someone digging. She had thought it strange but had not investigated, assuming that Margaret was perhaps burying a dead animal or dealing with some problem with the trees. The next morning, Margaret had seemed tired and had dirt under her fingernails, which she had scrubbed clean at the kitchen pump. Elizabeth remembered because Margaret was usually so fastidious about her appearance, and the sight of her with dirty hands had been unusual. Defense attorney Beaumont tried to discredit Elizabeth during cross-examination, suggesting that she had been fired from her position and was now seeking revenge through false testimony. But Elizabeth remained firm in her statements, insisting that she had left Margaret's employment of her own accord because she had grown uncomfortable in the house. She could not explain exactly why, she said, but something about the atmosphere there had made her increasingly uneasy. She had felt like she was living in a house with secrets, and she had finally decided that she needed to leave before those secrets somehow involved her. The testimony hit hard. Several jurors looked toward Margaret with expressions of disgust and horror. For the first time since the trial began, Margaret's composure seemed to crack slightly. A muscle twitched in her jaw, and her hands clenched briefly on the table before her. But she said nothing, and the moment passed so quickly that some spectators later claimed they had imagined it. Mitchell followed Elizabeth's testimony with evidence from Margaret's own home. During the search of her property, Sheriff Crane had found a locked wooden box in Margaret's bedroom. Inside the box were receipts for rat poison, purchased from 3 different merchants over a period of 5 years. Each receipt showed a purchase of arsenic-based poison, and the dates corresponded roughly to the periods when Margaret had been courting each of her victims. Mitchell also produced a small glass bottle that had been found hidden in the back of a kitchen cabinet. Dr. Morrison had tested the residue in the bottle and confirmed it contained arsenic in concentrations far too high to be used for any legitimate household purpose. The defense argued that many households kept rat poison, that farms needed it to control vermin, that the presence of arsenic was not proof of murder. But combined with all the other evidence, with the bodies in the orchard and the financial transactions and the testimony of witnesses, the poison receipts seemed to seal Margaret's fate. The jury members exchanged significant glances, and spectators in the gallery murmured until Judge Whitmore gavelled them into silence. On the 7th day of the trial, Charles Beaumont made the decision to put Margaret Holloway on the stand. It was a risky move, and many courtroom observers believed it to be a mistake born of desperation. A defendant who testified could be cross-examined, and Prosecutor Mitchell had proven himself to be thorough and relentless. But Beaumont apparently felt that the jury needed to hear from Margaret herself, needed to see her as a human being rather than the monster the prosecution was painting her to be. He believed, or perhaps hoped, that her composure and respectability might create reasonable doubt in the minds of at least some jurors. Margaret took the stand wearing a dove grey dress, her hair swept back in a style that emphasized her still handsome features. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth in a voice that was steady and clear. Beaumont began with gentle questions, establishing her background and character. She described her childhood in Virginia, her marriage to Thomas Holloway, their move to Tennessee where Thomas had established his successful merchant business. She spoke of her husband's death as a tragedy that had left her alone and struggling to maintain the property he had worked so hard to build. When Beaumont asked about the men who had courted her, Margaret's answers were carefully measured. She acknowledged that James Reynolds, Henry Atkins, and Samuel Morrison had all been suitors who had shown interest in marriage. She admitted that each had given her gifts or helped her financially, which she said was not unusual for men courting a woman they hoped to marry. She insisted that she had no idea what had happened to them after they left Fenmore. Each had told her he was leaving, she said. James Reynolds had received a business opportunity in Memphis that required immediate attention. Henry Atkins had been called back to Nashville to care for his sister. Samuel Morrison had decided that farm life did not suit him and wanted to return to the city where he had grown up. But when Beaumont asked directly if she had murdered these men, Margaret's answer was firm and unequivocal. She said no. She looked directly at the jury as she spoke, her grey eyes meeting theirs without flinching. She said she was a Christian woman who attended church faithfully, who had never harmed anyone, who could not even imagine committing the acts of which she was accused. She suggested that someone must have killed these men and buried them on her property without her knowledge, perhaps during times when she was away visiting relatives or attending to business in town. Her voice remained calm, but there was an undertone of indignation, as if she were genuinely offended by the accusations against her. The direct examination lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end of it, Margaret had presented herself as a dignified widow who had been unlucky in love, and was now being persecuted for crimes she did not commit. Some of the women in the gallery seemed moved by her testimony, whispering that perhaps there was more to the story than the prosecution had revealed. But the men on the jury remained stone-faced, and when Prosecutor Mitchell rose to begin his cross-examination, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Mitchell began slowly, almost gently, asking Margaret to confirm details of her testimony. Then, methodically, he began to tear her story apart. He asked why, if these men had left town of their own accord, none of them had taken their belongings with them. He asked why she had never mentioned receiving letters or telegrams from any of them after their departures. He asked why she had not reported their disappearances to the sheriff, why she had not seemed concerned when men who had supposedly loved her simply vanished without maintaining contact. Margaret's answers became less smooth, more hesitant. She said she had assumed the men had collected their belongings when she was not home. She said perhaps they had written letters that had been lost in the mail. She said she had not reported their departures because grown men were free to come and go as they pleased, and she had no authority over them. But her explanations sounded weak even to her own ears, and the jury's expressions grew more skeptical with each response. Mitchell then brought up the financial transactions, asking Margaret to explain why each man had transferred significant assets to her just before disappearing. She insisted these were gifts freely given, expressions of affection and intent to merge their lives. But Mitchell countered by asking why, if they intended to marry her, they would give away their assets rather than keeping them to contribute to their joint household. Margaret had no good answer. She stammered that each man had his own reasons, that she could not speak for their motivations. Mitchell nodded as if satisfied and moved on to his final questions. Mitchell's last line of questioning focused on the arsenic. He held up the receipts for rat poison, asking Margaret to confirm that her signature appeared on each one. She admitted it did, explaining that the orchard had a problem with rats and other vermin that damaged the apple trees. Mitchell asked if she had used all the poison she had purchased for pest control. Margaret hesitated, then said she believed so, though she could not be certain of the exact amounts. Mitchell produced Dr. Morrison's calculations, showing that the amount of arsenic purchased far exceeded what would be needed for normal pest control, even on a 5-acre orchard. Margaret had no explanation. She simply repeated that she had used it for rats, her voice now showing the first real signs of distress. Then Mitchell asked the question that would resonate through the courtroom and through Tennessee newspapers for weeks to come. He asked Margaret to look at the jury and explain how, if she was innocent, 3 men who had courted her had ended up buried in her orchard, poisoned with the same substance she had purchased in large quantities. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Margaret opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Her composure, which had held throughout the entire trial, finally cracked completely. Her face went pale, and her hands trembled visibly. She looked at Beaumont, then at the judge, then back at Mitchell, and she said in a voice barely above a whisper that she could not explain it. She did not know how those men had ended up on her property. She did not know who had killed them. But it was not her. Mitchell thanked her for her testimony and sat down. The damage was done. Beaumont tried to repair it during redirect examination, but Margaret's confidence was shattered. She answered his questions mechanically without the conviction she had shown earlier. When Judge Whitmore finally dismissed her from the stand, she walked back to the defense table with her head down, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. The spectators watched her in silence, and several later said they felt they had just witnessed the moment when Margaret Holloway realized she was going to be convicted. The closing arguments were delivered the next day. Mitchell spoke for 90 minutes, systematically reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness testimony, every inconsistency in Margaret's story. He painted a picture of a woman who had discovered that she could profit from the affections of lonely men, who had perfected a method of murder that had worked 3 times successfully, and who would have continued killing if Samuel Grant's shovel had not uncovered her terrible secret. He told the jury that they had a duty to the victims, to their families, to the community of Fenmore, and to the state of Tennessee to hold Margaret Holloway accountable for her crimes. Beaumont's closing argument lasted only 30 minutes. He made a valiant attempt to raise reasonable doubt, emphasizing the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the possibility that someone else had committed the murders and framed his client. But his words lacked conviction, and even he seemed to sense that the battle was already lost. When he finished, he sat down heavily beside Margaret, who stared straight ahead without expression. Judge Whitmore instructed the jury on the law, explaining the burden of proof and the definitions of first-degree murder. The jury retired to deliberate at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Spectators filled the courthouse steps and the surrounding streets, waiting for the verdict. Some brought picnic baskets, settling in for what they assumed would be a long wait, but the jury returned in less than 3 hours. The speed of their deliberation told everyone what they needed to know, even before the foreman stood to announce the verdict. Guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in noise. Some people cheering, others gasping, a few women crying out in distress. Judge Whitmore gavelled for order, and when the room finally quieted, he set the sentencing for 1 week later. Margaret Holloway sat motionless through it all, her face empty of expression, as if she had disconnected from the reality unfolding around her. Deputies led her from the courtroom in shackles, and as she passed through the crowd, people drew back as if from something poisonous and unclean. A week later, Judge Whitmore sentenced Margaret Holloway to death by hanging. Tennessee law required that she be executed at the state penitentiary in Nashville, and the date was set for January 10th, 1903. The sentence was carried out as scheduled on a cold winter morning, with grey skies and a bitter wind. Margaret walked to the gallows with the same eerie composure she had shown throughout her trial, refusing the hood offered to cover her face, wanting, witnesses said, to meet her fate with open eyes. When the trapdoor opened and she fell, the snap of her neck breaking was heard clearly in the silent yard. The house in Fenmore was eventually torn down, and the orchard was cut down and burned. No one wanted any part of the property where such evil had taken root. For years afterward, people avoided that plot of land, claiming it was cursed, that on certain nights you could hear the whispers of the men who had been buried there. Whether those stories were true or merely the product of frightened imaginations, the case of Margaret Holloway, the Fenmore widow, remained one of Tennessee's most notorious crimes, a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest monsters wear the most ordinary faces. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.